Okay, welcome everyone. Welcome to this policy roundtable on the impact of COVID-19 on the EU-UK relations. I will quickly introduce myself. I'm Agathe. I'm one of the Next UK team managers and a postdoctoral researcher at Queen Mary's Centre for European Research. So today we'll have three speakers. We'll have Stella, we'll have Sarah, and we'll have Justinas. We will give us some thoughts on these topics, and we'll also be joined by two discussants, Paul and Ellen, a little bit later. So we've got three speakers, two discussants, and we've got a question and answers and all the things in less than 1 hour. So I will be the timekeeper. You know the rule now. If you're going over time, I will have to wave my red flag. It will mean that you have to finish your sentence. And if you're going too much over time, I will have to cut your sound off. I'm really sorry, but I'm sure you know the rules and you will respect that. So the first speaker will be Stella. Stella is a senior lecturer in business and management. She's also one of the members of the Next UK project. So we're really happy that she's here to give us some thoughts on the EU socio-economic response to COVID-19 and how it has impacted the EU-UK relations. So welcome, Stella, and we're all hearing you.
Hello, Agathe. Hello. Thank you. Nice to see you all online in this roundtable. My intervention is going to be mainly on the economic governance aspect, and it is based on an article that we just finished writing with Dimitris Tsarouchas for a special issue that is going to appear soon at the Journal of European Integration. So the paper was talking mainly about what happened during the COVID-19 crisis with the economic governance in the EU. And I will just add a few thoughts about how this relates to the UK-EU relationship and how it will be developing. So what we argue in this paper is that although the first reaction to the COVID-19 as far as the economic governance goes was timid, was what we call single loop learning, meaning that there were some immediate decisions such as the ECB emergency purchase of state assets as well as the pandemic crisis support. This was like what we would expect. It was like the normality. What happened quite quickly was a much more radical change, which was the adoption of the Resilience and Recovery Fund, which was based on the Franco-German proposal that was then translated in the European Commission plan about how this could happen. So we say in our paper that this can be described as double loop learning in the sense that it goes beyond what we knew, because it changes the way economic governance is done at the EU level. So what we had up to now, up to COVID, was governance mainly focusing on regulation. So it was all based on regulation on targets, economic targets, and member states trying to comply with them. What is happening with this fund is that we have for the first time a redistributive function, which is, we argue that this is quite different. It has been discussed for a while in the EU, but it has not happened before. So we say that this could lead to path dependence, and that's why we would argue that this COVID-19 is a critical juncture for economic governance in the EU. Now, how this relates to the EU-UK relationship? For sure, we would argue that, I would argue, because Dimitris is not here with me today, and this is not part of our paper, that it wouldn't have been so easy to come up with this Resilience and Recovery Fund if the UK was still a full member of the EU. I think in a way it was easier to make this step towards this more federal moment of the EU, which we don't know if it will last and if it will be something that will affect the future economic governance, but certainly is quite radical for what we have now. Now, for the future relation, it certainly brings more stability in the Eurozone than we would have if there was not, if we didn't have this resilience and recovery fund. So in a way, it makes the Eurozone and the EU more stable during this period of transition and this period of negotiation. So I think this can be positive, depending on whether there is mutual trust between the two partners. I think these are the main points that I wanted to make. I don't know if I'm if I have more time, but maybe I would leave it for later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stella. You're right on time. It's really perfect. So I will move on to our next speaker with Sarah. Sarah Wolf is the NEXTEUK main investigator. She's also the director of the Center for European Research. And Sarah will present her thoughts on the future of Schengen with COVID-19. So Sarah, the floor is yours for about 5 minutes.
Yes. Thank you, Agathe. Hello, everyone. Nice to see you all. And like Stella and Justinas, indeed, I will. My starting point will be a paper that has been written on framing e-mobility, Schengen governance in times of pandemics. This is just a starting point for the discussion, and I will elaborate on EU-UK relations. This article has been co-written with Agathe herself and another colleague, Ayana Ripoll, e-servant, that you might have met in another panel session today on Parliament, I think. So we have co-written this article wondering what has happened to Schengen during the pandemic. I don't know if you have noticed, but I think, freedom of movement has been importantly disrupted during the pandemic, mostly motivated by, of course, public health reasons and the need to protect citizens. Just very briefly, we did a policy frame analysis, and we have surveyed about 800 documents, trying to identify what type of discourses have either continued or emerged as new amongst EU member states and the Council, the European Commission, and the European Parliament. Why did we spend all this energy looking at these documents and most of our summer? I think it's mainly because the disruption of Schengen and freedom of movement, I think, has gone almost unnoticed. I mean, we did experiment it, but it hasn't been discussed or debated from a political perspective during the crisis. It was emergency time, and this solution seems to have been quite easily accepted. Actually, EU institutions didn't have much choice because EU member states decided to use the arrangements of Schengen governance and to notify to the European Commission very early in March, I mean, with a wave of notification throughout different months. And I think it was about 17 countries that have reintroduced internal border controls. What is interesting is that they have used, and I'm sure our lawyers and Helen will have some thoughts about it, but the way they have suspended Schengen and used the legal basis in the Schengen border code is quite interesting, because there were other measures that could have been adopted, such as Article 29 of the Freedom of Movement Directive, that precisely offers the possibility to restrict the mobility of EU citizens in Europe as well in case of pandemic. So that's already our research puzzle. So why was the closure of borders the first measure taken? You also see that not all countries have actually closed their borders. You have the case, for instance, of Greece that has not closed their borders and actually did perform quite well when it came to managing the COVID-19 crisis. In terms of discourse, what we found is that contrary to the 2015 migration crisis, where Schengen was highly politicized and intensely, namely debated at the top and from a top and bottom perspective in political debates in Europe, there hasn't been much debate about the suspension of freedom of mobility. The main frames that came out following the reintroduction of internal border controls are mostly an economic frame. So for the European Commission, it was very, and some EU member states, it was very important to immediately allow and facilitate the circulation of goods. That was the main reason. The Commission didn't have much other choice but to be a solution maker, to be pragmatic, and to come up with solutions such as the green lanes, which have facilitated the circulation of health workers, health professionals or frontline workers. And especially the European Commission and the Parliament have used a functional frame of solidarity, coordination, and non-discrimination. Another finding that is interesting is that the public health frame was new. We had to protect, the reintroduction of border controls was justified by the need to protect citizens' health, but it was done so by linking it to traditional notions of security, internal security, such as maintaining public order for many member states. What does it mean for EU-UK relations? So at the moment, you see that similar, of course, measures, the UK has not been part of Schengen, but has during the pandemic adopted similar measures such as quarantine as well in times of pandemic. However, the UK still wants to keep access to the Schengen information system at the moment, and that's still, I think, being refused by or not being part yet of the deal. Germany especially is quite against it. And at the same time, I'm not sure if I can relate the disruption of freedom of movement, but we see that during the pandemic, and it's very difficult to know, we will have a discussion tomorrow with Violeta Moreno-Lax about the crossings in the channel, to understand whether they are motivated by the pandemic or Brexit. This is a little bit difficult, but just to conclude, I think to contribute to a more policy-oriented discussion, I think we clearly see, as Philip Rycroft has said, a success of gaining back control in the UK, and definitely in times of pandemic, unfortunately, it seems that the control of borders is really key for many EU member states and the UK, so we can draw a lot of similarities there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I will now leave the floor to Justinas, who also contributed to this Journal of European Integration special issue. Justinas is from Princeton University, and he wrote this article with Sophie Meunier on competition policy and COVID-19. So I will ask him also to go further than this article to explain what it may mean for the EU-UK relations, and to do so in 5 minutes.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here as a participant. Thank you for the introduction. It saves me the time to make the necessary qualifications that the paper we wrote wasn't on EU-UK relations specifically, but we'll try to cover it here. I'll try to cover it here. The paper we wrote starts with a essential argument that the COVID pandemic hit the EU competition policy, or more generally competition policy area, at a time when there was already a change and a contestation being observed that was novel and was qualitatively interesting, different than anything we've seen in the last 10 years or so. And in the paper, speaking for the EU, we hypothesized that the changes, the contestation, have a fairly clear direction towards a more discretionary pro-industrial competition policy, not abandoning the general liberal market principles, but accommodating through special measures, more pro-industrial R&D projects through state aid frameworks, and we've seen in the last year the Commission to impose novel measures that are within its legal toolkit, but have never been used, that are ex ante in nature rather than ex post, applied after a long and complicated antitrust investigation, etc. So we see a shift in both enforcement and sort of substance. And in the paper, speaking for the EU, we hypothesize that there are three drivers behind these changes: digitization of the markets, which raise both new conceptual questions for how to regulate market competition and challenges to competitiveness, given that digital markets are overwhelmingly dominated by US and Chinese firms. We see another pressure coming from geopolitization of economic competition in general, both because of Chinese expansionism in the global markets and because of a relative US withdrawal from the multilateral order, as well as an aggressive pursuit of its own interests. And lastly, for the EU, we hypothesize that Brexit might also be driving some of these changes, in part because it raises the risk of regulatory divergence after the eventual complete separation of Britain from the EU, as well as because Brexit immediately alters the member state coalitions that frame the political context for European competition policy development. For the UK, because we didn't focus on it, I can generally say that I would hypothesize that digitization also drove the debates that we've seen in the last 4 years since Brexit on competition, on the future of British competition policy. That was definitely a factor. Also, obviously, Brexit and the search for post-Brexit growth strategy was also a factor to consider for London. And the electoral questions also matter, given that the Tories have this ambition, sometimes stated, sometimes maybe only rhetorically, to win back the post-industrial lands. Maybe that raises the demand, creates more space for a more pro-industrial competition policy in Britain as well. So in both cases, change and contestation. And in the paper, we argued that in the EU's case, COVID only strengthened and accelerated these changes because, first and foremost, because it exacerbates the pressures we hypothesize. Digital companies become even more important. They become essential platforms for societal coordination, raising this need to regulate them. It increases the fears that Chinese shopping spree will, ravage European markets and essentially give space for a more protectionist, or at least a more involved protection of European industries, as we've witnessed with Commissioner Vestager's remarks about state building in European industries. And it also creates massive pressures for London to take care of its economy, already suffering from the uncertainty surrounding Brexit, but also now from the pandemic shock, raising the risk of regulatory divergence. So COVID strengthens, accelerates these ongoing shifts, largely in a way that we could expect from theory, given that crises generally intensify politicization of European politics, creating more space for policy entrepreneurs to come up with new both policies and legitimation tactics for policies, and also based on sort of interest mobilization theories, pro-industrial actors are generally have fewer collective action problems. They can mobilize faster. Consumers usually are relatively weaker. So we did expect that pro-industrial actors will use this space to push forward with the changes. And we can see that at this point, these changes have a twofold effect. On the one hand, they heighten the tensions in the EU-UK relations because of the growing pressure for regulatory divergence, given the recent controversies. I'm sure that might come up in the Q&A. On the other hand, because of the work that the EU has already done in the last 3 years in boosting its sort of protectionist measures, its tools that could counter third state subsidies and so forth, and related sort of instruments, it might be better prepared for whatever actual strategy related to British competition policy London ultimately takes. So there's some ambivalence there. The less ambivalent thing is that COVID has reinforced the changes that we've seen in competition policy in the EU. Thank you.
Thank you very much for these different views of the impact of COVID on the EU-UK relations. We see that there's different games of politicization, depoliticizations. We've got different entrepreneurs, different actors at the bottom of the change, or the lack of change, and only the continuity depending on the sectors. But to go further with these papers and this intervention, I will ask our two discussants now to enter the game. So we'll start with Paul. Paul will be our first discussant. He is also a colleague of the NEXTEUK project, the team member of the NEXTEUK project, and is a senior lecturer in public policy at Queen Mary University in London. So Paul, we are listening to your thoughts, to your ideas about this impact of COVID-19.
Great, thanks so much. I really enjoyed these papers, and I liked how in each of your presentations you're sort of relating those papers to the current dynamic around UK-EU relations. I think when I read the papers, I think there's something quite striking that always comes up with the UK-EU relationship to me, which is that actually what happens in the UK and the EU, they often run parallel to each other in the sense of policy similarities. And that's something I was sort of wondering about the three papers. Britain is leaving the EU, but there may be considerable continuity in terms of how those paths in different policy areas continue to complement each other. And it reminded me of a situation where in 2013, David Cameron vetoed the sort of balanced budget rule, only for the the EU balanced budget rule, only for the Conservative government to then introduce its own in 2015, 2016. So there's a lot of posturing that goes on between sort of London and Brussels. And yet, bizarrely, the policy similarities and continuities have always sort of remained. I was wondering then with Stella and your paper, I mean, one of the things you were saying sort of at the end of your discussion was that you think the agreement on the fund would have been more difficult had the UK have been in the room. But could the EU then have just not focused on the Eurozone, for which the UK could have hopefully stepped aside? That's often how the EU has created its own sort of path dependencies and have a sort of permanence. And we will look back at this moment as being the critical juncture, or could it simply wither away? And it would be sort of interesting to get some thoughts on that. I think coming on to Sarah's paper, I think when I read your paper and I was thinking about borders and the issue of the EU, it's surprising how much, it's surprising how borders have been erected over the last 5 years within the EU. There's a sort of switch that EU leaders press for a variety of reasons. And when I was reading your paper, it gave me a chance to think about how long this has been going on. And I say this as somebody who's not in your field. And I'm sort of wondering if you think there ever will be a return to business as usual here, particularly in the light of some of the populist governments we have across the EU. And I think you hit the nail on the head when you were talking about Schengen and how Britain still wants access to certain databases. And I think there was also a debate recently around Britain staying in the Dublin Convention and so on and so forth. And I just wondered, a sort of slightly controversial question for you, but do you think Britain fully understands Schengen? And do you think the British government fully understands Schengen and how it works and how it interacts with the bigger picture? And then finally, Justina's paper, I really enjoyed this paper as well. And again, it's got me thinking about sort of continuity and change. And the Brexit sort of referendum is really a reaction against a British political economy that's incredibly free market. And what we're seeing potentially is within the UK a drift away from that. It's unclear, I think, how far that drift will be. I think that's still an open question. But it's interesting that that is also happening at EU level as well. There's some soul searching around the future, I guess, of the sort of political economy of Europe. I guess a question would be, has Britain jumped off the ship too soon? In other words, could things change within the EU and competition policy to be, I guess, less neoliberal and more discretionary? And are we going to find ourselves in that strange situation where the changes in the EU political economy and the British political economy mirror each other, despite the fact that Brexit has happened? So I think, the papers are really fascinating, not least because I read them all together and then I'm a big picture kind of person. So I was thinking about all of these different issues and how they interrelate. And then the final observation, and this is just an observation from me, I've been pretty fascinated by how little the British media has focused on the better dealing of the crisis in COVID-19 across the EU and the member states vis-a-vis the UK. And I think really when you think of things like how the crisis has been handled, it's hard to deny that the UK is at the bottom of the list. Yet what is fascinating is how the media comparatively doesn't always pick that out. And I think there's a sort of really interesting research project around that particular issue. The silencing of EU issues throughout the COVID-19 crisis, I think is really problematic. But they were 3 great papers and it got me into some really big picture ideas. And I could go on for a very long time, but I'll pass over. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. You're right on time. You're even less than 7 minutes. So thank you very much for all these comments. And I think we've got a lot to think about, whether with economic change, with Schengen and competition policy. And I will let our speakers answer these comments and go through this thinking process in 1 minute, or maybe rather in 7 minutes after Hélène's comments. So I'm sure that Hélène, you will have some complementary view. Hélène, you're Professor of Law, Jean Monnet Chair of Law and Transatlantic Relations at City University. So I will leave you the floor for 7 minutes maximum.
Okay. So can you hear me? Yes. So yeah, thank you very much for this opportunity to read these absolutely fantastic papers. And I suppose, to my mind, the papers were exposing a lot of ironies, I think, at the times that we're in now. So the conference is on Brexit, but the papers are focusing on the pandemics issue. And there's, I think Sarah's paper is a fantastic example that, this explosion of soft law, which is at the heart of dealing with the pandemic, also in the UK. And we've seen this normalization of soft law governance and very Machiavellian usage of legal basis in the Schengen's border code, essentially be the main way in which the EU has operated. And it's really fascinating to see, Sarah, and in this paper, they look at the role of institutional actors. And of course, ironically, the European Parliament produces a huge amount of information, whereas member states didn't even some member states didn't even notify border controls. And I think you unpick the very delicate role here the Commission has. So when we think about Brexit, I think we're just used to seeing Michel Barnier's face, and this is very effort, but the role of the EU here in breaking apart and its institutional focus is very significant. I think it's also quite obvious that discussions with the UK on borders, or I don't know, the Dublin Corporation or databases are really gone out the window, or not considered really serious topics. And yet this goes to the heart of understanding the COVID issues. And certainly, as a lawyer looking at the explosion of soft law, this is in every aspect of COVID in every country, all over the world, people are wondering, what is the rules on COVID? How many people can I meet? And we've all been met with the same lack of transparency. And so the EU uniquely in the migration situation, or the Schengen situation, perhaps it is just like any type of crisis lawmaking. And in a sense, this is a very uncomfortable backdrop to have any kind of engagement with the UK, which of course isn't really happening. On the competition law paper, I absolutely loved Justinis's paper. I mean, fantastic ironic detail there. In June 2020, the Commission had passed by then €2 trillion of state aid, and yet in the same breath is adopting aggressive approaches towards digitization and the so-called the GAFAs, the Google, Amazon, and so on, going after this as an EU policy. Now, ironically, competition law is one of the few areas where the UK will truly get a huge amount of power back once it leaves the EU's regime, and this would be a very important reason to be strategically taking back control and to isolate and to diverge. It would be the main policy, if you like. And I think it's a fantastic paper detailing all of very elegantly the explosion of measures, the difficult questions as to state aid, of course, and mergers exploding now. But again, when we come back to Brexit, the idea of state aid is something which is, of course, at the heart of the Northern Ireland concerns at the moment, but of course cannot realistically be considered, since every country in the world is pumping money into their national economies. Who can have a realistic consideration about the role of the state now, when there's such a buffering up of the national in so many countries, in so many parts of the world? And I think that leads really nicely to Stella's paper. Had a fantastic engagement with this question of solidarity, rebalancing, reconsidering redistribution. As you say, this is not something that is at the heart of EU law policies. And there's some countries that have even failed or delayed in drawing down on their massive amounts that are there. And quite ironically, particularly in Italy, I know in Ireland, so there's very interesting examples of this. So it's a fantastic paper detailing all of this. And I suppose my main comment to all of the papers would be, I've just come from an event where the Commissioner for Justice, Didi Grenier, was saying you can't talk about transatlantic, or you can't talk about adequacy decisions with the UK because Brexit isn't even at that stage. Transatlantic privacy is this huge issue, 1 billion people. It's so important, but we can't even get that far. Well, I'd say this panel has the exact same issues. These are all uniquely important questions, Schengen, competition law, socioeconomic rights, but we're just not there. It's an extraordinary state negotiations that's literally at the edge. So I think that the panel brings to the fore so many important questions, so many crisis-related questions, but ironically, even those crisis-related questions can't even be matched in lawmaking in our times in the nature of negotiations. I'll leave that there. I hope I was under my 7 minutes.
That's perfect. You're under that time. So maybe we'll go through each speaker, and I will leave the floor to Stella to answer Paul and Ellen's comments.
Okay, thank you for the discussion and starting really talking to each other, yeah? Because in front of the screen, it's always strange. It's like talking to yourself. So yes, policies run in parallel. I think I really agree with that, that we see that in many of the policies that we discussed today, but also in other policies. And it's ironic because exactly at the time where the UK and the EU seem to be moving apart, their policies are running in parallel. But what we also see is that disintegration didn't actually happen. When the referendum took place in 2016, with Paul, we were hosting panels at the UASIS conference on disintegration and de-Europeanization, and we were trying to theorize and to discuss what is going to happen. I think what we are seeing, at least in the economic governance spectrum, but also in other policies in the EU, less in the Schengen, but this is a very specific moment, is that disintegration didn't happen. If we see redistribution, and it means that the EU managed to cope with this shock. So I'm sorry if I said Eurozone at some point. The Resilience Fund, the Recovery and Resilience Fund is 750 billion euros that it's for the whole EU. So it's not only for the Eurozone. So my point about the UK maybe making the discussions more difficult is just because of experience from past negotiations, not because I have really interviewed people about what would they think they would say in these negotiations, from the side of the UK, but because this redistribution, it's really a much more federal and it's quite far away from what the UK always wanted from the EU. So I would guess that it wouldn't be very easy to accept it. Now for the, if it is, if we're actually going to see past dependence and if this is a critical juncture, obviously it is early to say. All the actors are saying that no, this is not going to be the pattern. We're only going to use redistribution now because it is absolutely necessary to secure the EU and our economy. But what we have seen in the past is that when a mechanism, a tool, an instrument, an institution is put forward in the EU, very often it does create a path for future changes. So we've seen that exactly now, the first, what I call single loop change, the first changes that took place were actually very much based on what had been achieved during the Eurozone crisis, on the instruments and institutions that were immediately used. The ESF were immediately used, ESM, for creating the first buffer zone, yeah? So I wouldn't be surprised if this actually stays with us. We will see, because obviously we still haven't seen the implementation. So we still need to see the national plans of the governments and how the money will be redistributed, and also to see whether the European Parliament is going to accept that there has been cuts in other aspects of the budget, of the European Union budget, in order to support this resilience fund. I think they will accept it, because it would be crazy for the European Parliament to obstruct what has been seen as a historic decision. But they're making noises and they're complaining that more money should come also to the budget of the European Union. Yeah, I share Elaine's remarks about soft law, and that it's still, it's very difficult to put everything into law and into real regulation in times of crisis, and especially right now where so many different fronts are open, Brexit, COVID, all happening at the same time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stella. I will now jump to Sarah if you want to answer the comments in a couple of minutes.
Yes, thank you very much for your insightful comments. And yes, I think now having the whole perspective and not being in the nitty-gritty details of the papers, it also gives a lot of gives me a lot of thinking about the broader picture. Will there be a return to normal? Well, we are saying that there is a normalization of exceptionalism. That I mean, I always, used to start my lecture saying, the freedom of movement is a value of the EU. It's been so much cherished by so many citizens and businesses and different stakeholders in European integration, and yet we see that now it's clearly being disrupted. The only reasons why it would come back to normal, I think, are back to the origins of the project, which were economics, I think. So the economic drivers could maybe motivate a return to normalization. And I think in the end, highlighting also what happens with the UK, who wants to retain access to the Schengen information system. Security, internal security is still quite strong, but it seems that the ambition of some policymakers and citizens to really think about the freedom of movement for people is more at stake. We see it also with Brexit, taking back control. We see that EU citizens' rights also in the UK are under question. So it might be a normalization, return to normal when it comes to economics and internal security. There has been some exceptions and showing of solidarity with the move of patients across borders during the pandemic, but that was very local and specific. And we have seen also actually a sort of regionalization of Schengen with the apparition of mini Schengens across regional specific regions, for instance, in the Benelux, where it's been organized. But yes, borders are being re-emerging all over. And unfortunately, it's a similarity between the EU re-erected and the UK. Yes, how to go back to normal, I think, has to do with politicization also at the bottom as well. But yeah, unfortunately, I think just to conclude, I don't have a crystal ball, and Schengen to me is really a problematic area. Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much, Tara. I think it's a good synthesis of what we observed in this paper. So I will now leave the floor to Justinas to answer Hélène's and Paul's comments.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the enthusiastic and generally very kind comments. That's really nice. I'll maybe first address the more explicit question by Paul, which was, has Britain jumped the ship too soon? Abandoned the ship too soon? And it's really, it's really difficult to say because, as we argue in the paper, and I'll explain here shortly, Brexit wasn't necessarily the key driver of the reforms we saw in European competition policy, but it definitely enabled it politically. Specifically, such countries as Denmark, as the Netherlands, which were always in the British camp in all the competition policy debates, and are also highly interdependent with Britain. They saw that both their economic incentives are changing, but also just the future deal making in the EU on these kinds of issues will have to change a little bit too, and will have to be more accommodating to the Franco-German position just to get anything done. And so in 2016, Brexit happens in June. In July, the Friends of Industry group, convened originally by France, but then at that time meeting in Berlin, has the biggest meeting it has ever had, 20 members, including the Scandinavian, the Nordic, the Benelux countries, which are always the liberal competition regime sort of camp. They all sign a document that endorses, the initiatives that we've seen in the last couple of years. At that time, they were still only planned. So in some ways, Brexit itself enabled it, and it would be hard to, say that, Britain shouldn't have reacted to their economy in a way of, in the form of Brexit, because the economy, the political economy of the EU, at least in the competition area, would have changed. So I guess that's a non-satisfying answer to that question. But there's to react to the more general sort of comment about the UK really standing to gain a huge amount of control in state aid, the irony, as observed by Elaine. Well, I couldn't say that it's, so, how to say, unequivocally about getting back control, because I don't know even as of today if the UK is actually serious about any of its signaling about, becoming a more interventionist state, using the state aid toolbox. I could say that the COVID really forced its hand to adopt the industrial strategy route rather than the, Singapore on Thames, low taxes, which also would raise a different set of issues with vis-a-vis EU state aid policy. But we still don't know. In 2018, the UK spent 0.4% of its GDP in state aid compared to, Denmark's 1.5%. And Denmark, again, as mentioned, strict competition enforcer. Germany, order liberal, 1.4%. And, at that time, 2018, we already had 2 years of Theresa May's government talking about it. We need an industrial policy back. So I'm not sure to what extent it is serious, and for that reason, to what extent they really are to, theoretically they stand to gain control. But is there anything they would actually use that freedom to do it? I'm not so sure. But yeah, but COVID seems to push it maybe more to that direction. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will now pick up some of the questions from the chat of the event. So the first question, and Stella, you already answered partly to that through Paul's question. So the first one is from Sandra Eckert, and it's about competition policy. But some of the measures are meant to be purely temporary and temporary framework. So to what extent are the changes here to stay? Justinas, this question is for you.
Yeah, in the paper, we deal explicitly with this temporary versus more permanent change dichotomy. Yes, the changes we saw in the last 3 months in the area of competition policy are, clearly signaled as temporary, which is, we permit some sort of crisis cartels, mostly in the medicine sector. We suspend and now slowly, resume merger evaluation processes. And then in state aid, most notably, we implement these many different temporary frameworks. They are temporary, and the EU has been fairly successful at, returning to the norm if we are if we're examining the precedent of the financial crisis, where again, the EU had adopted at that time, immediately on the onset, a range of temporary state aid frameworks. But because many different member states, especially the small ones, feared a subsidy war, they still wanted the supranational authority to be effective, to stay, as the ultimate enforcer, which meant that at some point after, the crisis peak, the pressure had subsided, the Commission was able to issue, demands for recipients of state aid to restructure, that mostly in the financial sector. Something similar could happen here, but the more permanent changes, such as something that was first developed in mid 2010s, the important projects of common European interest, those I do think are likely to have a lasting boost in terms of the mentality of how much we can use such projects to sort of to incentivize more European firms and more member states to cooperate on big, huge industrial projects, very capital intensive. I think those kinds of changes are getting a permanent boost. And we saw that in the temporary decisions, you also had these extensions of these frameworks dating back to the early 2010s, which I think signals that those are here to stay. So it's a sort of a mixed response.
Thank you very much, Justinas. We have also a question from Polly. So this question is rather to Stella, and Polly is wondering, because you just say that the UK would have not been supported these redistributive policies. So Polly is just asking, do you think that the UK going its own way is a good thing or a bad thing from an economic perspective for the UK?
Sorry, I didn't hear the second part. So of what you said.
So the question of Polly is mainly about, is the UK going through its own way a good thing or a bad thing for the economy of the UK?
Okay. Yes, maybe for the first part, saying that probably it wouldn't support. This is just maybe to make it a little bit more concrete, and it relates to what Justinas was saying, that. Basically, the different power groups within the EU changed the moment the UK left. Yeah, so there is the Franco-German coalition has become, in a way, the major engine as it used to be in previous instances of the European Union history. So it's more that even countries that would object, like the Frugal Fours that we were discussing, found themselves obliged to follow what the bigger countries that they were willing to give the money in were suggesting. Yeah, I'm not sure if I'm answering the whole thing of what you asked, but I have a problem hearing exactly what you're saying. Sorry.
Okay, we go to another question, and if we get enough time, we can come back to this one. So the third question is from Olivier, and Olivier is asking everyone, is the UK moving towards a global Britain of free trade, deregulation, and low state aid on some in the UK government economic liberals? So maybe we'll start with Sarah about the UK heading towards what I call a global Britain of free trade, deregulation, and low state aid.
Yeah, I would tend to agree, but I think to be global Britain, we also need to lift up borders. So I think that's also an issue, and I think indeed possibly again economic drivers, free trade will be one of the motivation to do so. But unfortunately, I think possibly the UK will pursue more of this strategy through free trade agreements worldwide, if it managed to do so. But I don't think that freedom of movement with the EU for the moment is a priority.
Okay, Justina, do you want to answer this question too from your competition policy perspective?
Yeah, I would be hesitant to say that the UK is moving decisively to free trade, deregulation, and low state aid, simply because deregulation has proven to be more difficult today than in the 1980s, politically more costly. Again, as I just mentioned in my reaction to Paul's comments, the cutting taxes has also is less politically feasible, and I think to my latest knowledge, Johnson's proposal for the corporate tax cut was also shelved. So it seems that there are just obstacles politically to how far they could go in this direction. At the same time, the sort of not necessarily the inertia, but the legacy of the liberally oriented competition policy also puts a lid on just like how expansive state interventionism might be. The sort of the preview of the subsidy control regime that we saw yesterday also made a strong emphasis that we're not going back to the 70s, that we're still committed to the market dynamic principles, etc. So again, I think that Britain has been trying to maximize its maneuvering space, and I don't know if it was just a purely irrational tactical calculation, and to what extent it was due to the lack of inner settlement within the government, within the ruling political coalition. But my guess wouldn't be that it will go to be a free trader deregulation zone.
Okay, Stella, do you want to add a word on that?
I would agree with Justina's from the economic perspective, but also from the political. I think what we see, it's more of a period of internal reflection in the UK and of trying to bridge the cleavages that were created with this Brexit vote, and COVID is not making it any easier because it puts more pressure on the economy. So it makes it even harder to actually have this extrovert global perspective that was promised to the people. So I think we are heading to difficult days. Yeah.
So we're going to add on this quite pessimistic view, but thank you very much to Sarah, to Stella, to Justinas, but also to Elaine and Paul for their reading and their comments. It was really a pleasure to hear all your thoughts on COVID-19 and the impact on EU-UK relations. Thank you very much once again. Bye.